I'll introduce everybody for you. For the Dutch filmmaker Joost Rekveld, who's just to my left, this might mean vertical cinema as films that are flipped and scaled up to resonate on 13-metre tall screens, and vertical cinema will be screening at Deakin Edge on Friday night. And Joost's work is dedicated to exploring what we can learn from a dialogue with machines. And the body, on a cellular level, resonates rhythmically in the film, Joost's film that you'll see on Friday night, which is called, I think, number 43. His specific vertical contribution to the vertical cinema program. For Erwin, who's just on the end, Cinema Reimagined might be a combination of technologies or projections or images and sounds. Erwin van Hart has a background in art history from the University of Amsterdam, and he started working in the cinema department of Political and Cultural Centre de Bali in Amsterdam in 1997, where he curated several film and video programs. And since 2006, he's been working at the International Film Festival in Rotterdam as a short experimental film programmer. Besides this, he also works as a freelance curator, programmer, program advisor, and as a dedicated film technician for challenging projections like vertical cinema. So Erwin's been setting up over the last couple of days. For the UK-based filmmaker Sally Golding, cinema is reimagined, I think, as 16mm projections that might include lighting and sonic compositions to create a kind of expanded cinema performance and a kind of participatory installation. Her performances have been described as cacophonic and hallucinogenic fields of intensity which transcend flicker, waveform and light. Sally's projects thread between expanded cinema and media art, curation and audiovisual archiving. And we're really thrilled that Sally's latest work, Breaching Transmissions, will premiere at the new film space, Grey Gardens, on Thursday night. Sally's immersive audiovisual performance promises to take us on a hallucinogenic dark carnival ride. Very exciting. And to my extreme left, immediate left, is my colleague, Associate Professor Scott McQuire, who teaches and researches in the Media and Communication program, School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne, and he's also a director of the research unit in public cultures. For Scott, I think cinema might be reimagined on large screens in urban spaces, in city spaces like Federation Square perhaps, where images are not only scaled up but create connections between communities in Melbourne and across the world, including in South Korea. And Scott's the author of a range of publications that explore issues including urban planning, architecture, networked societies, Wi-Fi communication, large public screens, and I could go on for a long time. And I'm really interested in a 2013 article that he wrote called Mega Screens for Megacities. So this intersection of celluloid and digital in film history, it's the perfect time to think about how cinema can be imagined, how it can be reimagined and perhaps needs to be reimagined, perhaps by scaling it up vertically here as well as in the work of filmmakers like Tacita Dean, particularly in her film work entitled Film. And a similar vertical film ratio we see in a range of films, including those brilliant utopian sequences of dance and performance in Xavier Dolan's film Mummy, which we saw at MIFF just last year, and in countless other iPhone films. So those are our presenters tonight. We'll each have 10 minutes to talk to you about Cinema Reimagined, how we imagine cinema, and then we'll have time for a Q&A at the very end. And we thought that we'd start tonight by asking Joost first to talk about how he reimagines cinema.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for coming. I didn't really prepare a very formal presentation. I'm going to basically talk about the Vertical Cinema project and talk a bit about the backgrounds and the genesis of this project. Well, the still, which is probably the image you've seen of vertical cinema, is a vertical screen. It's a vertical cinemascope screen flipped on its side. You see it in the church. And this particular Church of the Image you've probably seen. It's a place it's in a small town in Austria called Krems, where the redaction, the group of artists and curators who are part of the Sonic Acts team, went to visit because they were asked to curate a series of festivals in that particular venue for a couple of years. And I heard that their first reaction when they entered the space was, yeah, this is a fantastic space, but what are we going to do with the projections? Because, you know, it's very narrow, very high. And then somebody made a sort of jokingly comment, well, we should just flip it on its side and it will fit. So that was basically this beginning of the idea, and then this joke was taken seriously, and then I think 4 years later was the premiere of Vertical Cinema project. And that's the reason for that this joke actually became something serious is that it sort of fell on fertile ground, like these people of Sonic Acts and yeah, sort of involved with their group. They all come from a culture, like a lot of them studied at the school where I used to teach for a very long time, where there was a lot of interest in issues of scale, and also interest in finding, developing forms of presentation which would fit particular works. And that's an environment where it's not only about visual art, it's not only about film at all, it's an environment which is very much also about performance, about music, mostly electronic music, and also about all the utopic dreams which all these new technologies have brought us. And it's also an environment where a lot of these utopic dreams were being examined and sort of criticized and looked at. And I think there was one project which quite a number of these people in the redaction have witnessed as students, which I think was very important in the history of this, what now has become Vertical Cinema. And that was a project around a dream formulated by Piet Mondrian, the painter, and which was the basis of a project which I think happened somewhere in the mid-90s. A project by a Dutch artist called Dick Reimagined, who's a composer, media philosopher, maverick, inspirer. There's really a lot of artists in Holland who are inspired by him. And what's interesting is that they all do amazingly different stuff. So I think that's always a good sign if people are not only copying. Dick Reimagined was involved as an assistant in the making of a poème électronique, which is perhaps some project you heard about. It was in 1958, the pavilion for the World Exhibition in Brussels, the Philips Pavilion, where Edgar Varèse made one of the very early electronic music pieces. Anyway, back to Mondrian. Mondrian formulated a kind of vision of a future art form, which he called the promenoir. Promenoir comes from the French word se promener, so it's about walking around, wandering around. And this idea was basically a fusion of the ideas of a sort of neoplastic environment which Mondrian had, and then fused with his love for jazz music and dance music. When Mondrian was living in Paris, he was obviously painting, but he also loved to hang around in these places where dance music was played. And this hanging around, he was thinking, well, that needed a special environment, and that was his promenoir. So he sketched an environment of horizontal and vertical visual elements. And also, at some point in that particular article, he talks about horizontal and vertical music, which is a very abstract notion, which in some way gets realized much later in the early history of electronic music. So it's a very interesting, obscure, short text, which never really got realized. I mean, it was sort of part of the universe of Mondrian, of course. I guess a lot of you know the pictures of his studio. So it was part of that environment. It's not a project which was ever really formulated as a project, it was more a vision. And the idea of this project at this particular school in The Hague was to sort of re-examine this very early utopian vision and sort of look at it critically and also compare it to a lot of the sort of technological utopian scenarios which are being painted for us by manufacturers of technology or people who are interested in developing technologies. So I think that was a very important moment, and it also means that basically from the beginning, the Sonic X Festival, I always had an interest to sort of think of strong visual statements as part of the presentation. So there's a long history of thinking of different formats and asking performers or visual artists to make works, especially for those formats. Okay, so that's a bit about the sort of local history, you could say, of this project in the Sonic X team and the Sonic X redaction. And then about vertical cinema itself. So basically the essence of the project is that we have 35 CinemaScope film and it's flipped on its side, which is a very awkward thing to do. It's very impractical. The nice thing about film is that you can ship film around the globe. Well, if you have it vertical, you can't, because you have to ship Erwin with it, and the projector, and the screen, and it's hell. So why do this? One reason, it's in a way a kind of tribute to celluloid. It resonates with this project by Tessie Tadine, perhaps. It's really a choice to do it on celluloid, which is now, of course, disappearing, which will sort of change the landscape and which changes ideas about filmmaking. So that's one reason. And the flipping on its side is a kind of subversion of a very closed format. Like CinemaScope is a format which was invented by the film industry at the point when television came, in order to keep cinema goers in the cinemas and to sort of win the war with television. So the idea was that the audience had to be impressed with sort of large, epic stories in sort of nice horizontal vistas. So it's a very loaded format in that sense. And if you turn it on its side, it's sort of opening up a space. When I was asked to make something for vertical cinema, I was doing also research and sort of looking at the history of these things. And what I find is very interesting, if you look at histories of media, and in the history of celluloid, it's not that obvious, but if you look at the early history of television, it's much more obvious. There's in this early period of the development of a medium is always a period of about a generation where things are not yet fixed, where standards are being negotiated, where all kinds of dreams are being formulated. And it's really, for me, it was a big surprise to discover that if you look at the early history of television, it took about a generation to determine if television should actually be horizontal or vertical. And there were a lot of the early experimental television systems were actually vertical because the resolution was so low that they were mostly used to just show one speaker or perhaps two. So you had this scan lines and one image of one face. Basically, it's more like a kind of image telephone almost. So for me, this idea of switching the CinemaScope format on its side is also a kind of shout out again, like of sort of opening up this format again in a period where, if you look at digital media, in some ways there's no reason why digital format should ever be fixed. The reason that our computer screens are horizontal is because we watch movies on them which already exist and which were made in CinemaScope. But if you look at mobile phones, if you look at any moving image you make on a computer, there's no particular reason to choose one format over another. I think we still, digital media is of course also not so young anymore. I think we're sort of nearing the end of this generation where all the standards were being negotiated and we're sort of getting into more fixed territory already. But I still think that for a lot of applications, there's actually really no reason why any standard should be fixed. I think one of the very interesting things about digital media and computers is that the fact that there's such open machines which permit so many possibilities. I think in that sense, this whole project is a sort of cry to keep those options open. I think I would like to.
Thank you. Yes.
I didn't really prepare for a formal talk as well, but Joost knows what he's talking about as an academic. I'm here invited as a technician for the Vertical Cinema project. When I was asked by the Sonic X team, would it be possible to do how to project vertically on analog film, we had to really think, and I think it wasn't that easy as what Joost was saying. You just flip a projector on the side and then it's done. Most projectors, they don't like being flipped on the side, you know, and they stop running. Sorry. So we had to give it some thought, and we've been trying out things with mirror boxes, for example, which turned out to be very unpractical, or been calling some people who were involved in the lenses industry, projection lenses, advanced projection lenses, but it turned to be a very, very difficult case, expensive mostly, to get the things done like that. So in the end, like, okay, let's keep it simple, flip it on the side. Don't do it in Tadzita Dean style, because actually she was faking vertical cinema. The way she did it, she has this whole statement in the book about vertical cinema, but actually what she did, she printed horizontally on film. And she printed perforation holes with it to give it the look of film, but actually it's a fake. So with the Sonic X people who are very media-oriented people, we have to do it authentic, genuine, how to do this. So you need to use the whole image and do it, stretch it, like with CinemaScope, how it should be, and try to turn it on the side. And we have to look for a projector who is capable of doing this. And luckily we found one. Actually, there's, I think, only one type of projector capable of doing that, because it's not a traditional projector in the traditional sense. It's more like an electronic hybrid of a projector. It was the manufacturer who, before cinema turned completely digital, it was a kind of analog digital projector, not with a Maltese cross, if you know what that is, in an oil bath and stuff. It's step motors, belts, and everything, very neatly done. And you can flip it on the side, you can juggle with it. And it's a heavy machine, but it works very well. So we needed to adjust that, put it on the side, adjust all the rollers and the lamps, and voila, it was a beautiful premiere, and it worked well. The pictures looks impressive, that everyone all over the globe is interested in the project, and now we're here. Yeah. And I think it's the choice of the filmmakers that the Sonic X team made is also interesting. Many of the artists, like what Joost was pointing out, they have not really a film background. There are all types of pieces in it. There's a 60mm blow-up with handmade emulsion. There's, on the other hand, a complete born digital piece as well, and all sorts of hybrids in between. And there's actually one piece that, one of the pieces I love very much over in there, which kind of a video artist, Billy Royce, who makes video streams. And actually the film, I congratulated her with the last screening that her piece caught the first piece of dust ever in history, a digital piece. It looks very beautiful. This makes it a special project to work with. And I'm willing to answer any technical questions about it if you have it after we all did our talk.
Thanks.
Well, I guess I'm going to jump off from vertical and horizontal planes and talk more about the liveness of cinema. I guess I'll start by saying that for me, my interest is, it's a dual interest and a dual practice in both performing live cinema and also curating other artists for live cinema as well. I think for me, that's the key. I'm interested in the liveness. I'm interested in the immediacy of showing film in a context with an audience. I'm interested in a way that an audience responds to the dynamics of film when they're rearranged and presented and performed in a space. Maybe a lot of you here, or some of you at least, will be really familiar with the concept and the idea and the history of expanded cinema. For me, that's kind of the reference point for the work that I curate and program. To maybe describe it briefly, expanded cinema, I think just to say as well that expanded cinema could really be interpreted in many ways, and many people will have many descriptions of expanded cinema. But for me, I would say that it's really an historical term that came really from a period, particularly in the 60s and 70s, with a group of artists and filmmakers, but even more so artists who started to turn to film, and of course who started to seek to rearrange the typical components of, so not so far away, rearrange the typical components of the industrialized film system. So I think about expanded cinema as the elements being rearranged, projection beam, projector, screen, audience. And I think in the same sense, somebody asked me today actually, well, how does expanded cinema translate into the contemporary? And I think there's a very similar thread for contemporary artists working in a live film capacity. But for me, I'm particularly interested in artists who are still working with celluloid, still working with film as a material and still exploring its really its beautiful properties, the quality of light, the texture of emotion, both as an object and when projected. So for me, though, with my practice and the work that I curate and program, I'm really interested in this liveness. I'm really interested in, well, starting to consider how the way that the audience is activated, the audience is not so much passive watching a screen, but the audience can become immersed in the work by the nature of the materials and the nature of the situation. So I'm always kind of trying to find a way forward when making new work that kind of challenges that dynamic. Maybe sometimes it comes off or not, I don't know, but I'm always looking for a way which people can become really sort of, Wendy described the work as being sort of hypnotic zones, colour fields flicker, the work that I'll be doing on Thursdays in the psychedelic program. So I really like these kind of immersive environments, for lack of a better description. But yeah, so I guess that's kind of where I'm at with it. And I say that I also just as much like to curate the work, and for me it's always been a way to experience. Maybe some of you here might have seen some of the shows that I used to program in Australia as other films. So I spent a lot of time across the cities in Australia trying to bring expanded cinema artists here so we could see them and experience them ourselves. So it's a great way to kind of see these works. And maybe, I guess the point of this is hopefully some of you will get to come on Thursday and find out about this new work that I've been creating, because I don't know, we could talk about it, but the point is to experience it and the liveness. But I can talk a little about the new work. Well, previously I've been working a lot in expanded cinema, so I work with celluloid, but my focus is really creating sound compositions onto film. That's certainly become the focus for the last few years that I've been working. So more and more I'm really getting rid of the image and disregarding the image and just focusing on creating sound compositions on film and working with, I guess, light environments, repurposing the projector, playing a lot with the light and the values of light and adding in other light devices, other sound devices. But the way I often create work is I work in the dark room, typically just on a tabletop, and I'll work in a way using contact printing or photogramming you might be familiar with, laying down raw film stock and laying down soundtracks on top like a kind of collage or composition and printing them with the torchlight. So I like to think of these as darkroom compositions. So my interest really has become around the sound. So bring that back to the work that I like to program as well. I'm really interested in works which are really dynamic in sound, and maybe that stems from having run so many shows where often we've been presenting to sound art audiences and music audiences. So it's kind of nice to knit these kind of ideas together, I think. But the work, I'm probably just rambling now, but the work for Thursday is a new work which is a collaboration with a British sound artist and I guess he's a technologist, he's a software programmer, sound artist, audiovisual artist. So it was a kind of it was a great opportunity to kind of bring something new out of the processes that I work with, to get a little bit away from my darkroom compositions and to draw a little bit more of those hypnotic environments out. So the work on Thursday will use also analog soundtracks, analog 16mm soundtracks. It'll use infrared camera imaging, it'll use shadows and light play and sonic composition and small custom-made sound devices and custom-made software. I guess, in a way, these are kind of like interactive environments. You can walk through them, experience them. I mean, this is the kind of thing I'm interested in getting away more so from the screen. But I'm not sure where to lead this, because I think I'm going to go up a thematic path here, but I guess for me, reimagining the cinema has always been about the liveness and the opportunity to kind of create an environment that people will find something and interpret something in. It's about the moment and the space.
Great, thanks, Sally. Let's go.
Fabulous. That wasn't supposed to happen quite like that. I'm really interested in picking up the threads that Joost and Erwin and Sally have talked about between standardisation of cinema on the one hand, the way it produces a very stable disposition of the audience to the screen, and particularly a stable frame, a stable aspect ratio, and then the creation of more idiosyncratic or individualised scenes of viewing that are possible. I mean, when you look at the history of cinema, which is, 120 odd years now, and there's pretty consistent technological change, but the relation of the audience to the screen is a really stable element that's been there. Yeah, we have different frame sizes, but it's mostly a horizontal frame. And there's really only been one major shift that's taken place, as Joost was saying, with the emergence of CinemaScope in the 1950s in response to television. So you went from the old Academy ratio, which is about 1 to 1.37, to a ratio of 1 to 2.5, or as it often is now, 1 to 1.85. The stability is hardwired into the real estate. It's actually very hard to shift when you think about it, because the screen is configured into the real estate. And if you want to do something dramatic about that, it would become very costly. So you constantly see people evolving different projection systems, but they always get hung up on that chicken and egg problem, where if you don't have content in a certain format, you don't want to build the venues for it. If you don't have the venues, why would you produce the content for it? And so you see a number of experiments over the whole history of cinema. Abel Gance in 1927 with his Polyvision, a 4-to-1 ratio for Napoleon. Things like Cinerama.
I projected that.
Sorry?
I projected it.
Okay, fantastic. Cinerama with a 3-projector system in the 1950s, producing this very wide curved image. The one I was probably the most interested in was the one that Doug Trumbull did, the ShowScan system, which you guys might have seen. It was done in the 1980s. This is a 70mm image, 5 perforation, and he projected at 60 frames a second. Now, most people won't have seen this, but it's just the most fantastic colour saturation. It produces a really sharp image. But of course, there's nowhere to put those films in a commercial setting. Doug Trumbull was very famous from doing the Stargate sequence in 2001 and went on to develop a lot of different film technology. So it ends up being a ride film technology. Probably the one exception where you see a different format evolve is IMAX, and that's largely thanks to the Canadian taxpayer who supports the system for a decade before it becomes privatised and a bit more commercialised. So it's actually really hard to change the format of the cinema image. I'm not saying that's all a bad thing. I mean, as Joost was saying, that means cinema becomes global. It's a global medium. You can shoot anywhere, you can reproduce anywhere, so it enables this kind of wide circulation. But it does mean that the image repertoire is fairly limited, especially when we compare it to other visual forms. So you think of painting with all the different kinds of frames. I think the horizontal image is going to remain dominant in film and in television. It's way entrenched, but there are other kinds of relations emerging, and this is where I'm sort of picking up on Sally's idea of expanded cinema and the different relation to, particularly to the viewer, because you think when you're sitting in the cinema, there's this whole protocol where you sit in a seat, it's silent, it's dark, you're immobilised, you're faced with the image. When we go to something like a large screen, can we have the next image? This is a project we did working with a large screen in Federation Square called Hello, done in 2011. One of the things working in a screen that's situated in a public space is your audience is mobile and contingent. In other words, they haven't necessarily chosen to come there, they're moving on through. And we thought about what would happen if we used those screens not just as a display space, but as an interactive space. And in this work, it was basically a dance game where people in Seoul, in another large screen, and in Melbourne would teach each other a dance, and it would be done live, and it would be done both in these interior spaces, little tents where people would work 1-on-1 or 2-on-2, but it would also be projected onto the whole screen. So it's a kind of participatory dance game. The movements are always going to transform. I think what was really interesting for us was the different modes of connection that came up for people, because people, and we did audience research on this, but people really experienced a lot of intimacy in the process of teaching the dance, as well as the kind of public display that takes place in the process of going outside and seeing your image or your friend's image put into public. And I think this was very much one of the intentions behind expanded cinema, to explore the different disposition or different embodied relations that you can have to the screen. So that's where I'd sort of connected to that kind of expanded cinema moment.
Okay, so at this point, we thought we might open it up for any questions from the audience. We invite anyone.
Can I ask a question while other people are thinking?
Of course.
I wanted to ask Erwin, what happened when you turned the other projectors on the side? Because they wouldn't like the loss of gravity, would they?
That's true. Well, I didn't try many tire models. I think when one was enough and it started to rumble, it was enough for me. It was kind of an evidence not to go any further.
You could have a kind of destructive cinema, though.
Oh, yeah, easily. Yeah. Yeah.
What I was trying to get to at the end is frameless images, images that don't have the same frame, whether it's vertical or horizontal, and I think 3D is still more a framed image.
Yeah.
3D's been significant in its latest reincarnation. It's been there for 80 years in various forms, but it's significant because it killed off celluloid in the commercial industry. It was the driver for a lot of uptake of digital projection, but that's probably the only significance I'd give it in that sense.
Or otherwise, 3D's always been a wonderful stimulus for experimental film artists to hack industrial systems and riff off the kind of motivation of these, again, maybe hallucinogenic ways to see cinema or inventive ways to redevise. Certainly it's a beautiful medium to look into. But I guess that's where you draw the line between industry format versus other industry format versus gimmick. So the industry is always sort of fighting itself, like with the variations in formats. But yeah. It's a wonderful way to hack industrial systems.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice way to hack 3D is to put the glasses the other way around. You get inside out 3D.
I definitely will try that. Thanks, Joost.
It was definitely the future of cinema when I started making films, which is quite a long time ago. And I find it very interesting what happened to it. Like, it sort of disappeared. Like, it was there for quite some years when I saw it was sort of end of the 80s, early 90s, when it was sort of being pioneered and sort of projected on us as, so this is going to be the future, like we didn't have any choice, really. And then it's vanished. And now it's sort of coming back a little bit in the Oculus Rift, which is a bit perhaps similar to why 3D comes back. Like, it seems that somebody invented a way to sort of standardize this and make it much cheaper and sort of mass produce it. And I think there have been a couple of projects in virtual reality which have been super interesting. We're exploring also ways of interactive storytelling or these kind of things. But I think for me, 3D and virtual reality, they sort of promise something which I, as an artist, don't find very interesting at all. It's like this sort of dream of complete immersion or complete, where I think, well, if I want to be immersed, I step out of the door, and immerse myself in the world. And that's a bit the thing with virtual reality, and that's, I think I know quite a number of artists who work with augmented reality and who think that that's a much more interesting way because it's much less sort of this sort of bubble of technological utopia which is sort of being thrown at us, and augmented reality is much more interesting because you have to actually deal with the real world, and you get like what Scott was referring to. There's lots of very interesting projects of overlaying storylines or trajectories on a real space, a real city, like all these kind of things. So I think the future, like I'm an artist, so for me the future is about what's interesting, what I find interesting. So then I think virtual reality is definitely not the future, but I'm not in charge. And
Joost is in charge. I think one limitation with VR is that it's the way the technology is developed is individual system. I mean, one of the characteristics of cinema is that it's collective spectatorship. And that's a really important characteristic, and that's certainly for the kinds of public projects we're talking about, it's that collective. If you could have VR systems where you could have everybody here inhabiting a single environment, now that might get really interesting. And we've done some work at the university with Microsoft around hacking the Connect system basically to try and, because you can, with the new system, you can get multiple users. But 6 is not that interesting, but 50 is really interesting for us, when you can start to get that kind of system with 50 people interacting in a single environment. Then I think it would become something different. Maybe it wouldn't be cinema, but it would still be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Building's been done like that, where they spray a cloud of water and then project images on them, and that's an excellent screen. And it's also cooling the building.
And in fact, here, just in Screen Worlds, at the very end, is the incredible Anthony McCall installation, really, which is just smoke and absolutely no boundaries around the screen, because the screen is the entire space. So maybe it says something for the way that screens are changing, moving beyond the regular frame, and even maybe beyond a kind of flipped or horizontal frame as well.
Well, in that sense, the Anthony McCall piece is often referred to strongly as an architectural piece or a sculpture work. So those kind of dynamics and those kind of ways of thinking about it within other formats and other ways of considering how these works can be viewed and seen and experienced is kind of important too, rather than just the screen and the material. They're a whole new dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's right. They also projected onto a conical screen. They had a kind of big cone coming out of a flat screen with a cone protruding. They also projected onto silvered and gold screens. I had the great fortune of getting to project their expanded cinema work for them during a retrospect at Other Film Stage. They certainly have the Cantrell's work, if you haven't experienced it before, is well worth looking into.
Looked at it, but I've noticed that there is, it's a bit like, if you look at the history of perspective in painting, there's one argument to sort of explain the emergence of perspective is to say that it's sort of inherent in our optical system, and which I think is completely ludicrous. And there's a similar ludicrous argument to say that screens should be horizontal because our eyes are next to each other. And we have a sort of circular field of view which is wider than it's high, which is no reason at all. I mean, why would that be a restriction? It's very strange. So that's, I think, the closest I've come to what you're suggesting. I think in eye movements, in fact, I mean, it's interesting that you ask. I mean, it's not an answer to your question at all. I'm hijacking it to talk about my own work because I'm an artist. One of the concerns I had in my recent work, and especially also for the vertical cinema piece, what I really like of this sort of imposing format is that it sort of liberates you. Like, you don't have to, like on a small screen, you have to sort of grab the attention of the viewer. Here you can be quite sure you have it, because it's there, the screen. Which sort of liberated me for this piece I made for the vertical cinema to do something which is much more slower and sort of gentle and sort of unassuming in a way, subtle, than I could normally do, I felt. And one of the things I was really thinking about is how the gaze of the viewer can sort of travel around on the screen. And I've done some horizontal cinemascope films before, I was sort of interested in similar concerns. And one of the pieces I'm working on now is actually trying to use eye tracking of a small audience, like 4 or 5, to generate the images as which are being projected as input to a generative system, to achieve some kind of, I see it as kind of choreography between the eyes of the viewers and the motions on the screen, which is at all not an answer to your question. I'm sorry.
One place you might find an answer to that is the advertising industry, because they're really looking at the use of the small screen and vertical and horizontal video. And I saw research recently that said 2 times as many people watch their videos vertical rather than horizontal. So you're getting vertical, but in the small screen.
Yeah, but I think the interesting thing about this question is that it's sort of, well, we were talking about it this afternoon also in the seminar. There is this idea that there are sort of physical universals about our body which can sort of be a basis for aesthetical decisions. And I'm not sure. I mean, there's some, and I'm sure there's more and more being discovered. But I think in this case, our field of vision is pretty circular. Our eyes are very mobile. There's no real preference for them moving horizontally or vertically. So I think if you do in this research, what they're detecting are cliches, like things which have become cliches, and sometimes for a reason, but also which have become cliches because they've been sort of reaffirmed over and over again and become a kind of culture. But there's no reason for an artist to sort of adhere to them at all. You can do the opposite, and it's going to also work and be perhaps more interesting.
And Joost, am I right in thinking that your particular film that you're showing on Friday night has a connection to the body as well?
Yes, yeah, but that's something which is not very specific to vertical cinema, but more to my work.
Yeah.
In general, is that I'm like sort of the last years I make work which is very much inspired by science mostly, not with the real sort of big agenda because I'm interested in scientific subjects. But one of the things which really interested me is that if you take, for instance, a mathematical model of something, it generates images which are often very evocative. And in this case, I used a mathematical model of how nerve impulses travel through nervous tissue. And what's interesting about is that for instance, our heart is a sort of bundle of nervous tissue also, and the way our heart keeps beating is that there's a sort of self-enforcing wave of being propagated, and it's very hard to stop it, which is why our heart sort of keeps beating all the time. And what's interesting, if you have this mathematical model and you make a sort of simulation and you look at these patterns on the screen, is that they're very evocative of other things, of growth, of ant colonies, of termites, mounds, or a lot of other natural processes where there's also some kind of propagation and some kind of inhibition, and that's a bit the sort of balance which you see. And that goes back to an interesting sort of complex system, chaos, and all these kind of things. And what I find interesting is that, on the one hand, I find it really interesting to look at science and sort of be inspired by it. But what I find interesting is that when you look at these kind of images, in fact, there is a sort of visual language, or you can have a kind of non-verbal physical connection to these things, because a lot of these processes are very familiar. If you look under a stone in your garden or in your cup of water, or you see similar things. So we know them, so they're very sort of familiar in a quite intimate.
And I had a little sneak preview of your film as well, and noticed that it was incredibly rhythmic too. So we were talking earlier today about visualizing music. Was that an influence?
Yeah, well, the reason why I started making films is I started putting on film shows and being really interested in experimental films. And at some point I came across this history of abstract cinema and the idea of visual music, which is often the sort of idea of a lot of people to get started to sort of move on to something else. Which is basically the idea of a kind of dream of a moving image form which can do things which affect us in a similar way as music affects us, to put it very briefly. And that was for me really a sort of inspiration to get interested. And my background before I started making films was also in electronic music. I studied composition. For me, when I make a film, a lot of it is, in the end, comes down to animation, which is often meticulously planned. And planning and composing are not very far from each other.
And then I have a lighting mixer and some lighting set up. So in this situation, the viewer is very much part of the work. The images that I was projecting across these installations have a very similar thread. They're kind of, in some ways, they make you consider your mortality, or perhaps I think they do. I think, again, you can draw so many different ideas from these kind of experiences. So I was projecting images which were potentially dead or undead, ghostly, or a little bit, off-putting in that way. So I was kind of interested in the viewer being part of that work. So when the lighting mixer flicked on the lights, then you would see yourself, the way the two-way mirror works, I'm sure you can imagine. So you'd see yourself highly lit and reflected in that work, and then the back projection perhaps of this ghostly undead character projected with that, so you meld with the image. So I'd like that kind of, it harks back a little bit to early cinema, phantasmagoria, those kind of devising cinema like that. But I like in a way that that's a little bit unexpected when you come and see a work like that, and then you do have to consider yourself in the work as well. So I guess there are many ways to play with those kind of devices.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the changes that's happening is once you can take film outside of the cinema, or you can take art outside of the gallery, which has happened a lot more in the last 20 years, you see a convergence. I mean, art's always had political aspects to it, but you see a convergence between forms of political protest and forms of public participation, aesthetic participation. I think that's quite significant. So I think there's lots of examples of the kind of work you're talking about, which has that political edge, but it's also about an assembly of people, about people gathering together. And all of those movements that took place, 2011, 2012 was, in the Middle East, and the Occupy movements and the Ignados and so on. There was enormous public art that took place in the context of those movements. So I think you're right that there is a particular kind of apparatus that can be used in those spaces now.